You think you've heard crazy HOA stories before? Neighbors fighting over grass length, mailboxes that aren't the right shade of beige, fences an inch too tall. But what you're about to hear is on a level of madness that even seasoned cops shook their heads at. It starts with a Jeep parked quietly in the driveway of a man who thought he was just minding his own business. But this wasn't just any man, and this wasn't just any Jeep. To one woman, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, this vehicle was a threat to her power, an insult to her authority, and a chance to remind everyone who really ran the neighborhood. She didn't know where it came from. She didn't ask who it belonged to. She just decided in her twisted logic that it didn't belong. Letters were written, meetings were held, rules were waved around like weapons. And when that wasn't enough, she did the unthinkable, marching up with bolt cutters in hand, fueled by arrogance, and slicing through a lock that was never hers to touch. She thought she had won. She thought she'd taught a lesson. She bragged. She smirked. She played the role of neighborhood sheriff. But what she didn't know was that the Jeep she had just claimed victory over didn't belong to a random homeowner at all. It belonged to a police task force, one that had been watching, waiting, and preparing for someone to make the very mistake she had just made. From that single arrogant act unraveled a story of humiliation, exposure, and justice so sharp that neighbors still whisper about it. So buckle up, because this isn't just a petty HOA fight. This is the day Karen thought she ruled the street but ended up facing the full weight of the law. Every neighborhood has that one person who believes they were chosen to keep everyone else in line. And in this neighborhood, that role was owned. No, ruled by Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. To a stranger, she looked harmless enough. Polished blouses, a clipboard glued to her hand, and that tight blonde bun that made her look like she was always one step away from running for office. But beneath the surface, she was a storm waiting to strike. She didn't just enforce the HOA's rules. She twisted them, stretched them, even invented them on the fly, turning every regulation into a weapon she could use against her neighbors. And she wielded them with ruthless precision. Karen patrolled the sidewalks like a prison guard, snapping photos of recycling bins left out for a moment too long, pulling out an actual ruler to measure overgrown grass, and firing off violation letters that read more like legal threats than friendly notices. And while she told herself it was all about protecting property values, everyone else knew it was about power, about feeding the thrill she got from making people bow. Most neighbors caved under her iron rule, repainting mailboxes, swallowing fines, and keeping their heads down just to avoid being her next target. But fear doesn't last forever. It only takes one person to refuse to bend, and that person was about to park something in Karen's kingdom that would shake her illusion of control to its core. Because this Jeep, this rugged machine that didn't belong to her world of manicured lawns and strict parking regulations, wasn't just a car. It was tied to something far bigger, far more dangerous than a woman with a clipboard could ever imagine. And by deciding to make an example out of its owner, by cutting the lock and treating the Jeep like just another trophy of her authority, Karen wasn't proving her dominance. She was walking straight into a storm that would unravel everything she thought she controlled, one arrogant step at a time. The Jeep sat there like a challenge, parked at the edge of Karen's pristine kingdom, and every time she walked past it, her blood boiled a little hotter. It wasn't that the vehicle was dirty or broken down. No, in fact, it was the opposite. A rugged, powerful machine that looked like it belonged on a battlefield rather than a quiet suburban street. The problem was that it represented defiance, a neighbor who had ignored her warnings, refused to bow to her endless rules, and dared to lock the Jeep in a spot that Karen had declared unauthorized. That lock, thick and heavy on the gate, mocked her authority, reminding her that here was one boundary she couldn't cross without breaking the very image of power she had built. And the longer it stayed, the more restless she became. Nights found her staring out her window, watching it gleam under the streetlight, imagining the whispers of other residents, wondering if they were laughing behind her back, questioning whether their queen bee really held the crown she claimed. To Karen, it wasn't about the Jeep anymore. It was about the story it told, the crack it put in her carefully painted image of control. And she knew that if she didn't do something, if she didn't act, her power would slip. And once power slips, it never comes back. So she began plotting, scribbling notes on her clipboard, rehearsing excuses she could use if anyone asked questions, convincing herself that what she was doing wasn't a crime, but a service to the neighborhood, until finally the day came when her obsession boiled over into action. Armed with bolt cutters and that familiar smirk of superiority, Karen walked up to the lock, raised her hands, and with one decisive snap, the chain fell away, an act she thought sealed her dominance, but in reality, it had just lit the fuse of a firestorm she could never hope to control. The sound of the lock snapping echoed louder than Karen expected, sharp and final, like a gunshot in the quiet suburb. But instead of fear, it filled her with a rush of triumph. She swung the gate open, strode to the Jeep, and laid her manicured hand on the rugged steel, almost as if she were claiming a prize that had been denied to her for too long. She didn't know much about cars, but she knew this one was different. The heavy-duty tires, the reinforced panels, the faint markings on the dashboard that seemed out of place for a civilian vehicle. Still, her arrogance drowned out any caution. To her, it was just another rule-breaker's toy, and she would show the entire neighborhood that no one, not even him, could outsmart her. What she didn't see was the man a few houses down, watching from behind half-drawn curtains, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the unmistakable symbol stamped near the rear bumper, a discreet emblem tied to a police task force, a vehicle that wasn't just registered, but protected by law. His chest tightened, because he knew that the moment Karen crossed that invisible line, she wasn't just messing with a neighbor's car, she was tampering with government property. But Karen, lost in her delusion of power, tugged at the Jeep's door with a self-satisfied grin, completely unaware that every second, every reckless move, was dragging her deeper into a trap of her own making, a trap that wouldn't just end her reign over the HOA, but might very well put her face to face with handcuffs and headlines she could never live down. The Jeep door creaked as Karen yanked it open, the smell of oil and leather wafting out. But instead of finding a messy interior like she expected, she froze for just a second. Everything inside was meticulously organized, too clean, too precise, as if the vehicle wasn't for casual drives, but for missions, operations, something official. Maps were neatly folded in the side pocket, a rugged radio device sat mounted on the dash, and a black duffel bag rested on the back seat, heavy and zipped tight. Her eyes lit up with greed, convinced she had stumbled upon contraband she could use against her neighbor, more leverage to cement her control. But what she didn't realize was that every second she lingered, a tiny, blinking light under the steering wheel was silently transmitting her every move, a tracker tied to a network she couldn't even imagine. At that very moment across town, a task force officer's phone vibrated, an alert flashing across the screen. "Vehicle breach detected!" And as Karen adjusted her grip on the steering wheel, sliding into the driver's seat like she was queen of the world, she had no idea that she wasn't just playing a power game anymore. She had officially triggered the involvement of people who operated far outside HOA meetings and property fines. The quiet, suburban street was seconds away from turning into the stage of something much larger, and Karen, so sure she was untouchable, was sitting right in the center of it. Karen's hands gripped the wheel with a smug satisfaction, her reflection in the rearview mirror showing a grin that could only belong to someone who thought they had finally won. She tapped the horn twice just to make sure the neighbors noticed, savoring the drama of her conquest. But behind the calm facade of the street, wheels were already in motion. Literally, 2 unmarked black SUVs turned off the main road a mile away, their headlights off, engines humming low, guided by the silent alarm that her little stunt had triggered. Inside the vehicles, officers communicated in clipped, efficient tones, each one knowing the protocol. Secure the asset, Detain the intruder. No mistakes. Back at the Jeep, Karen tossed her purse onto the passenger seat, digging through the compartments with the reckless curiosity of someone who thought laws were just suggestions. She found the duffel bag and smirked, tugging at the zipper, completely blind to the fact that the bag wasn't filled with anything ordinary. It was evidence, locked and sealed, the kind of evidence that never belonged in civilian hands. At that exact moment, a faint clicking sound reached her ears, almost like static, but she brushed it off. What she didn't know was that a hidden microphone had just activated, and every word she muttered, every arrogant laugh, was being recorded and transmitted live to the task force team closing in on her location. She thought she was in control, but in reality she was already surrounded, and the net was tightening with every careless second she wasted inside that Jeep. The neighborhood was quiet, eerily quiet, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Karen, oblivious to the tension building around her, leaned back in the driver's seat and scrolled through her phone, probably already planning the dramatic HOA post she'd make about how she taught her neighbor a lesson. But just down the block, headlights briefly flickered before vanishing, 2 SUVs rolling to a silent stop with precision that screamed military training, not neighborhood watch. 4 figures stepped out, moving quickly but without panic, their boots barely making a sound on the pavement, their eyes locked on the stolen Jeep. One officer raised a fist, signaling the others to hold position, while another crouched low, scanning the area through a pair of night vision goggles. Every detail was being logged, every move calculated. Inside the Jeep, Karen still had no clue. She hummed to herself as she tugged harder at the duffel bag zipper, completely unaware that her fingerprints alone could compromise months of undercover operations. Then, faintly, a low static crackled through the hidden radio in the dash, followed by a clipped voice. "Subject is inside the vehicle. Maintain perimeter." Karen's head jerked up, her brow furrowed. For the first time, a seed of doubt crept in, but it was too late. She was no longer in control. She was the target of something far bigger than a petty HOA dispute, and the hunters were already circling. Karen's smirk faltered when she caught a flicker of movement in her side mirror, a shadow slipping across the far end of the street, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. She shook her head, convincing herself it was nothing more than a nosy neighbor or a trick of the light. But the truth was far more dangerous. The task force was now fully in position, forming a silent box around the Jeep, each member waiting for the go signal that could come at any second. Inside the vehicle, Karen finally managed to pry open the duffel bag, and her eyes widened at the sight of files stamped with bold red letters. Confidential. Federal use only. She didn't understand what it meant, but greed sparked in her mind as she imagined the leverage she could hold with such documents. She pulled out one folder, flipping through photographs and coded reports she couldn't make sense of, laughing softly to herself like she'd stumbled into some great treasure. But with every careless second she spent, her fate sealed tighter. Across the street, an officer whispered into his radio, "Visual confirmed. She's compromised the bag." Another nodded, his hand already resting on his holstered weapon, eyes never leaving the woman in the driver's seat. Karen thought she had pulled off the ultimate HOA revenge, yet in reality, she had just crossed a line most people never return from. The silence shattered in an instant. Red and blue lights burst to life at the far end of the cul-de-sac, bathing the quiet neighborhood in a harsh glow that made every shadow leap against the walls. Karen froze, clutching the stolen file to her chest, her mouth hanging open as the low roar of engines filled the street. SUVs boxed her in from both sides, tires screeching against the asphalt, and before she could even process what was happening, men in tactical gear surged forward like a wave of controlled fury. "Hands where we can see them!" one barked, his voice sharp enough to slice through the night. Karen's pulse spiked as she instinctively fumbled for the door handle, but a blinding flashlight beam locked her in place, forcing her eyes shut. She had no idea these weren't just cops. They were federal agents, armed and furious that a suburban rule enforcer had just stumbled headfirst into a classified operation. The duffel bag lay wide open on the passenger seat, its contents glowing under the flashlight like damning evidence. And Karen finally realized this wasn't an HOA spat anymore. It was the kind of trouble that could bury a person for life. Karen's voice cracked as she raised her trembling hands, trying to force out words faster than her panic could choke them. "Wait, this isn't what it looks like. I was just securing community property," she stammered, her polished HOA confidence dissolving into frantic babble. The agents weren't moved. One yanked open the Jeep door, dragging her out with a swift, practiced motion, while another snapped the files shut and slid them back into the duffel bag, as if every second exposed was a national risk. Karen twisted in their grip, heels scraping the pavement, eyes darting desperately for a sympathetic face among the dark helmets and stone-cold stares. "You don't understand," she pleaded, her voice rising. "I'm on the board. I have rights here. That Jeep was illegally parked." Her words, absurd in the weight of the moment, only earned her silence and the tightening of the agent's grip on her arm. The task force wasn't here for explanations, and Karen, for the first time, felt the crushing realization that her power meant nothing outside HOA meetings. In the harsh light of federal authority, she wasn't a leader. She was a trespasser, a thief, and now a liability. The agents shoved Karen against the hood of the Jeep, the cold metal biting through her blouse as another flashlight beam swept across her pale face. One agent leaned in close, his voice low but heavy with authority. "Do you even know what you've gotten yourself into?" The question hung in the air like a noose, and Karen's lips quivered as she tried to form an answer, but nothing came, just shallow gasps of disbelief. The agent snapped his fingers, and another dropped a folder in front of her, flipping it open to reveal photographs she didn't understand. Blueprints, coded maps, and surveillance shots of places she couldn't even name. "This Jeep isn't some neighbor's toy," he growled. "It belongs to a joint police task force, and those documents you just tampered with are part of an active operation." Karen's eyes widened, her arrogance crumbling into sheer terror as her brain scrambled to process the reality. She wasn't in charge anymore. She was standing in the middle of a classified mission, caught red-handed, and every excuse that had once given her power now sounded pathetic. The weight of her actions pressed down like a crushing tide, and for the first time, she realized this wasn't about HOA rules. It was about survival. Karen's wrists were yanked behind her, cold steel cuffs biting into her skin, as the agents dragged her toward an unmarked black SUV idling at the curb. The neighborhood, once her kingdom, where she barked orders and ruled over petty disputes, had fallen silent. Every curtain drawn back, neighbors peering out in stunned disbelief as the mighty HOA president was hauled away like a common criminal. Her pleas grew desperate, tumbling over themselves in a high-pitched rush. "Wait, you don't understand. I was protecting the community. I didn't know. It's a mistake." But the agents didn't flinch. Their faces were carved from stone, their focus unwavering. As they shoved her into the back seat, the slam of the door echoed like a gavel, delivering judgment. Inside, the dim light revealed more files, laptops glowing with encrypted maps, and radios crackling with coded chatter. This wasn't just police. This was something bigger, colder, and far beyond Karen's comprehension. For the first time, her mind, once sharp with schemes and HOA rules, was completely blank. She had no arguments, no clever excuses, nothing but the suffocating fear that she had stepped into a world where her name, her title, her authority meant absolutely nothing. The interrogation room was nothing like the glossy dramas Karen had seen on TV. It was colder, harsher, stripped of any humanity. A single buzzing light cast sharp shadows across the gray walls, and the metal chair beneath her felt like ice against her back. Across the table sat two agents, one silent with piercing eyes that never blinked, the other flipping casually through a thick file as if her entire life had been reduced to pages of evidence. Karen tried to speak, her voice trembling. "This is a misunderstanding. I didn't know." But her words were cut short by the slam of a folder against the table. Photographs spilled out, her breaking into the Jeep, her rifling through documents, neighbors whispering complaints about her unchecked power. The silent agent finally leaned forward, his tone razor-sharp. "We don't care about your HOA squabbles. What you touched tonight wasn't yours. It belongs to us, and tampering with it makes you an obstruction to a federal task force." Karen's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst, her palms slick with sweat as she realized every excuse sounded emptier than the last. For years, she had relished control, dictating what fences could be painted, what cars could park on the street. But here, stripped of her title, she was nothing but a trembling woman staring down consequences far bigger than she had ever imagined. Agents exchanged a glance, the kind of silent communication that said more than words ever could, before the quieter one finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate, each syllable dropping like a stone into Karen's chest. "Do you even understand what you interfered with?" He slid a new set of photos across the table. Grainy surveillance images of men exchanging duffel bags in parking lots, coded documents, and maps with red circles around safe houses spread across the city. Karen's breath hitched as she leaned closer, her eyes darting between the images, struggling to comprehend. The agent didn't give her time. That Jeep wasn't just a car. It was bait, part of an undercover operation targeting a syndicate that makes your petty HOA power games look like child's play. You cutting that lock didn't just steal property. You blew open a hole in months of surveillance. The words struck like hammer blows, her stomach twisting as the reality sank in. She wasn't being treated like some nosy neighbor anymore. She was a liability, a disruption to something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. For the first time in her life, Karen felt small, insignificant, like a pawn who had wandered onto a battlefield where the players dealt in shadows, secrets, and consequences she wasn't prepared to face. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down on her until she could barely breathe, as the terrifying thought crept in. This time, she might not walk away with just a fine or angry neighbors. This time, it could cost her everything. Karen's perfectly rehearsed bravado was crumbling, her polished smile now just a nervous twitch as the weight of the agent's words bore down on her. She had always been the one pulling the strings, the one bending rules, twisting arms, and making others squirm under her authority. But now she was the one cornered, stripped of power, staring at the abyss of consequences she couldn't talk her way out of. The taller agent leaned in, his voice sharp as a blade. "We don't need you, Karen. We can charge you, bury you in a case that'll keep you locked away for a decade." Or, he let the word hang, heavy, poisonous, dangling like a rope in front of her. Her eyes snapped up, desperate, terrified, clinging to that single thread of hope. "Or," she whispered, her voice cracking. The agent slid another folder across the table, filled with names, addresses, notes, people in her community she had reported on, manipulated, even blackmailed to keep her grip on the HOA iron tight. "You've got access," he said. "You've got influence. You can help us flush out who's been feeding information to the wrong side." Karen's stomach churned as she recognized familiar faces in the files. Neighbors she had bullied, families she had tormented, people who would gladly watch her burn. Betray them, and she might live. Refuse, and she might disappear into a cell where her title, her rules, her entire identity meant nothing. For the first time in her life, Karen felt the crushing truth. Survival would demand a price higher than any HOA fee she had ever enforced. The room was silent, the air so thick it felt like time itself had stopped, waiting for Karen's decision. Her manicured hand trembled as she reached for the folder, her polished nails clicking against the paper, each sound like a gavel striking judgment. She had spent her life believing power was something you seized, controlled, enforced. But now she understood it was fleeting, fragile, and could be stripped away in an instant. With every page she turned, every name she saw, the realization cut deeper. There was no escape, no victory left, only the hollow path of betrayal, or the steel bars of prison. Her eyes darted toward the agents, searching for a crack of mercy in their cold, unblinking stares, but there was none. "Fine," she whispered, her voice breaking, a shadow of the HOA tyrant she once was. "I'll do it." The agents exchanged a glance, satisfied, and closed their files with a snap that echoed like a coffin lid sealing shut. In that moment, Karen's empire of control collapsed completely. Not with fire, not with rage, but with a whisper of surrender. She had gone from the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood to a pawn in a game far bigger than she could ever control. Outside the interrogation room, the Jeep she had once tried to claim as her own sat untouched, silent, a symbol of the battle she had ignited and lost. And as the rain began to pour against the glass, washing the night in silver streaks, it was clear. Karen wasn't feared anymore. She was owned. And that, my friends, is how the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood found herself stripped of her crown, her pride shattered, and her so-called power reduced to nothing more than a bargaining chip in a game she never even understood. But as one storm ends, another always brews on the horizon. Because in the world of HOA drama, there's always someone else waiting to push the limits, cross the line, and test how far they can go before karma comes crashing down. The question is, who's next? Stick around, because the next story isn't just shocking. It's a revelation that will make this one feel like child's play. If you think Karen's downfall was the end, you're wrong. It was just the beginning. Don't miss what's coming. Like, share, and subscribe, because the next twist is already unfolding. And trust me, you don't want to be the last to know when it hits.